Let's start with an overview of Azure Active Directory. Understand that everything that occurs inside of Azure is going to need some sort of authentication mechanism. Azure Active Directory has tons of features to help your organization meet the needs of a cloud environment. Let's start our overview of Azure Active Directory by asking some questions. First question is, what is Azure Active Directory? So what kind of functionality does it have? What do you do with it? And why is it there? Next, what is going to be the difference between Azure Active Directory and normal Active Directory that's been around for decades? Next, let's take a look at what kind of features and licensing options are available for different types of Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory has a ton of features and functionality, but the core functionality is all about authentication. Microsoft defines it as a cloud-based identity and access service. So what does that actually mean? If you've ever used LiveID to connect Skype, Outlook.com, or even OneDrive, you've used Azure Active Directory. This is just an external-facing version of Azure Active Directory. But when you log on with your credentials to Azure Active Directory, then the credentials authenticate you, and the other services are available. In exactly the same manner, you can view how you log into Azure exactly the same. You would have access to Azure and additionally access to all the services that reside inside of Azure. Additionally, Azure Active Directory is an identity tool. It allows you to create and manage users and also groups. Let's say we have a particular service inside of Azure that we only want certain people to have access to. For this example, the box is a service and the lock is going to designate if authenticated users or groups would have access to that service. So if we consider the individual from the previous side that was logging into Azure Active Directory, and the way that Azure Active Directory allows a user into another system is through a technique called authentication. Once a user is authenticated to Azure Active Directory, now they have access to different systems. I also mentioned you could also manage groups. So rather than having to individually go through every user and explicitly apply permissions inside of Azure Directory, you can add multiple people to a group and then provide access to the entire group so they're authenticated and now they have access to that service. Azure Active Directory is also a licensing tool. When you are using Azure Active Directory with other services like Microsoft 365, you can assign licenses to users. This is a sample screenshot from Azure Active Directory that shows the licenses assigned to different Microsoft products for an individual user. Here you can see the individual licenses active and also the amount of enabled services that are used up. In this example, I have 22 licenses available for Office 365 Developer E3, and all 22 have been utilized. Azure Active Directory is tightly integrated with Azure and allows roles-based access control, or RBAC. Inside of Azure Active Directory, there are many different types of roles available. Let's start in a resource group and see some of the different roles available inside that resource group. The first three include owner, contributor, and reader. If you consider the reader role, this would be very useful if you wanted to provide access to support personnel to log into the Azure portal and do initial validation if a user reports an issue. But because they only have read access, they would not be able to restart a virtual machine. Let's take a look at Virtual Machine Contributor role. This role lets you manage virtual machines but not access them, and not the virtual network or storage accounts they are connected to. I also verified that one of the permissions available in this role is the ability to restart a virtual machine. What is the difference between Azure Active Directory and Active Directory? This won't be an in-depth comparison, but just want to highlight some key differences. Starting with user functionality, Active Directory mostly uses on-premise and was focused for internal users. With Azure Active Directory, you can now sync to the existing AD so users can have access to Azure resources. Additionally, Azure Active Directory allows the ability to use SCIM or System for Cross-Domain Identity Management, so you can manage single sign-on functionality to third-party services like Slack. For credentials, there were not many features available for Active Directory. You were limited to passwords, certificates, and smart card authentication. But with Azure Active Directory, you now have multi-factor authentication, FIDO2 for passwordless authentication, and also the ability to offer self-service password reset. For mobile, the normal Active Directory did not have any native functionality, but with Azure Active Directory, you now have the ability to offer device management because of the integration with Intune. For Linux and Unix systems, most organizations that considered themselves to be Microsoft shops intended to really struggle because Active Directory offered nothing natively. With Azure Active Directory, you can utilize managed identities to access these systems and also use those in containers. Let's get into the Azure Active Directory features and edition options. There are actually 4 different editions of Azure Active Directory available. The first edition is known as Azure Active Directory Free. This free edition is available with any service from Microsoft. This includes Azure, Dynamics 365, Intune, or Power Platform. The next edition is Azure Active Directory for Office 365 apps. By default, you're provided with the free version of Azure Active Directory, but as you select different licenses from E1 to E5, there are additional features added. The third edition of Azure Active Directory is called Premium P1, or commonly referred to as P1. The features added to this version include seamless hybrid integration, multi-factor authentication, application access, and frontline workers capabilities. The final edition of Azure Active Directory is called Premium P2, or commonly just called P2. It includes everything from the P1 edition, and you're also provided with more authorization capabilities, including conditional access. It also has another feature to provide an end-user self-service. In this section, we went over what actually is Azure Active Directory, also compared the differences between Azure Active Directory and regular Active Directory, and finally looked at the different licensing and feature options that are available inside of Azure Active Directory. This concludes our Azure Active Directory overview.
For more details, check the link in the description. Learn with Whizlabs. Success certified.